Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to workshop 4 on non-financial misconduct. We'll just wait a moment or two for everyone to join. But just a reminder, just to please pop yourselves on mute. Thank you. Okay, we've got 42 people at the moment. So I think we'll make a start. It's 1 minute past the hour. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome. Welcome back to our non-financial misconduct series. We are 2/3 of the way through, or approaching 2/3 of the way through. Module 4 today, workshop 4 today, on conducting fair and effective investigations. It's the same format as we've had with other sessions, so I will very shortly hand over to Sunita, who will just sort of take you through some of those housekeeping points. I remind you just to please pop yourselves on mute unless you're asking a question. I will open the chat for questions, and as with the other sessions, feel free to jot those down in there. But again, we will have a dedicated session and some time at the end where we can have a Q&A session as well. Likewise, we will also do the breakout midway through, where we'll pop you into 2 groups to have that facilitated session. Once again, enjoy the session. Thank you very much for taking the time to join. I know we're just approaching sort of the summer holidays, the school holidays, but it seems that this does still work for people in terms of timing and date. So enjoy, and Sunita, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to workshop 4. As Andy's already said, it's the 4th workshop in the non-financial misconduct series. So today we're going to focus on the vital part of non-financial misconduct response cycle. So it's how we investigate concerns once they've been raised. Because investigations, it's not just a process, they are a signal of whether fairness matters and whether the organisation is willing to look closely into its own behaviour. So whether people can trust that if they speak up, something meaningful will happen. So in this session, we're going to explore not just how to investigate, but how to do it fairly, consistently, and in a way that reinforces trust rather than eroding it. We'll connect regulatory expectations with some of the cultural implications. We'll look at some real examples, how they've been handled well and some poorly, and think together about what good looks like in practice. So as with previous sessions, for those of you who've joined before, your experiences are a core part of this conversation. So we really want you to engage openly, share your questions, your challenges, and your perspectives. So these workshops are most powerful when we learn from each other. As I think the last session, we had a really good session in the breakout room. So just another quick reminder that Padda Consulting is still offering its free 30-minute one-to-one consultation on non-financial misconduct or culture to any firm participating in the series. Several of you have already booked some time in, and it's been a great way to dig deeper into firm-specific issues and contextualise those. So feel free to reach out via LinkedIn or email, and we'll get that arranged. But before we dive in, as with anything, there are the usual housekeeping notes. So this session is being recorded, and that's to meet the UK GDPR requirements. So by continuing, you acknowledge the recording, and if you have any concerns, please do raise your hand or put something in the chat. Please can I also ask you to keep your microphones on mute during the main presentation. So when we do break out into the case study sessions, you'll be invited to unmute and contribute openly. So if you have any questions along the way, as I said, drop them into the Teams chat, and we'll address as many as we can in the Q&A at the end. And if we don't get to your question, we'll make sure that we do follow up with an FAQ document which the trade bodies will circulate to you. So what we've got in store today, we'll start with a focus presentation, walking you through investigation best practices. Then, as usual, we'll break into case study discussions, so one for the SMEs and one for large. As before, you'll be automatically assigned to your group, and each room will have a representative from one of the trade bodies to support the discussion. But I really want you to note that the breakout rooms are not recorded, so please do speak openly and speak freely. When we hit the case study slides, it might be worth taking a photo of the scenario. I'll remind you when we get there. And also, we'll be using Mentimeter polls throughout the session, and fingers crossed that they all work. Last time only half of them worked. So please have your phones handy, and you'll be able to scan a QR code to take part. And we know we get asked this question all the time, and yes, the slides and the recording will be shared with the trade bodies after this session, so you can refer back to the material or share it internally with colleagues. Thank you again for being here, and now let's just get started. So before we dive into the content, I want to briefly walk you through what we're aiming to achieve today. So our focus is on how to conduct structured, fair investigations into non-financial misconduct. So this might sound procedural, but it's much more than that. A well-run investigation protects not just the integrity of the process, but it's also the culture and credibility of your respective organisations. We'll talk about what fairness looks like in practice, especially when power dynamics or informal structures get in the way. And then we'll also look at how to apply disciplinary actions that are both proportionate and aligned with your policies. This is one of the most sensitive areas of practice, how we balance the seriousness of an issue, the organisational impact and precedent without sending unintended signals. So fair action isn't just about what you do, it's about what people perceive was done and whether it reinforces or erodes trust. And trust has been a big thing throughout all of the workshops. And finally, we'll explore documentation, not just what the regulators expect, but as a cultural signal. What you document, how you document it, and how that record holds up over time says a lot about your organisation's values. So documentation also protects everyone involved. So that's the employees, the investigators, leadership, and creates the foundation for some lessons learned. So as we go through the session today, I encourage you to reflect on how these objectives apply in your own context. Where are the gaps? What would a fair process really look like in your firm? And what's one thing that you could take away from today to strengthen how investigations are handled? So let's take a moment to ground ourselves in what you expect to walk away with by the end of today's session. So hopefully you'll leave with a clear understanding of how to run investigations in an organised and structured way. So that means knowing what are the key steps from intake to fact-finding to reaching a conclusion. And how do each of those steps in a way that builds confidence in a process. We'll also be focusing on how to take fair and appropriate disciplinary actions. This can often be the most difficult part, striking the right balance between holding people accountable and applying judgment that's consistent, defensible, and proportionate to the situation. We'll explore how to assess severity, impact, and precedent while still honouring your organisation's values. And then the third outcome is all about documentation. And I want to be clear, this is not just about record keeping for the sake of compliance. It's about building a transparent, evidence-based approach that shows your decisions are thoughtful, fair, and aligned with policy. Good documentation also protects you legally, reputationally, and culturally. And finally, we want to ensure you walk away with some practical tools, not just ideas. That includes strategies, templates, and real-world approaches that you can take back at your firm and apply straight away, whether you're handling a sensitive complaint next week or building out your internal processes for the long term. So throughout the session, think about how these learning outcomes connect to your organisation's investigation culture. What's working? what needs strengthening, and where you might need to shift practice to better reflect fairness and consistency. So let's start by asking a bigger question. Why do investigations matter? It's tempting to see them as a process issue, a compliance necessity, but investigations are so much more than that. They are one of the most visible and consequential ways your culture shows up in real life. The quote at the top of the slide captures this perfectly. How an organisation investigates tells you more about its culture than any value statement ever could. Because in those moments when something has gone wrong, well, people are watching. They're watching to see, will this be taken seriously? Will it be fair? Will power dynamics override the process? Will it be swept under the carpet? But when investigations are fair, structured and transparent, this does help to build trust because people see that concerns are handled consistently. They reinforce your values because action is aligned with what you say and what you stand for. And they increase psychological safety, which we know is a key driver of the speak up culture. And from a regulatory perspective, this also matters. The FCA, for instance, has taken enforcement action not just for misconduct itself, but because firms fail to investigate it properly or take meaningful action. So the process isn't just about protecting the business, it's about demonstrating accountability to your employees, regulators, and stakeholders. On the flip side, when investigations are handled poorly, when they lack that structure, lack that transparency, and lack that fairness, the damage is amplified. People stop speaking up, reputational risk escalates, and your values can quickly become meaningless in practice. So as we move into the next section, I want you to think about how your firm's investigation processes show up culturally. What do they signal to your people? What story do they tell about what matters here? So let's take a look at how we bring that structure and fairness to life. So when we talk about fair investigations, we're not just talking about ticking boxes. We're talking about building trust, both in the process and in the people responsible for carrying these investigations out. And now that trust depends on getting 4 things right: being neutral, timely, well documented, and communicated. So let's start with neutral. This is about more than just about avoiding bias. It's about creating confidence that the investigation will be objective. This means appointing someone who has no prior connection to the case, who can remain impartial, and who is trained to manage unconscious bias. And just as important, it means managing perceptions of bias. Even the appearance of partial bias can erode trust in an outcome. Then you've got timely. Investigations that drag on and send a very clear message. Either this issue isn't a priority or the process is broken. Neither message inspires confidence. So timely investigations don't mean rush it, but they do mean manage it well. That includes setting expectations right at the outset and keeping people informed throughout that process. Then you've got documentation. It's not just about a compliance issue, it's a cultural signal. Documenting what steps you took, why you took them, creates a clear record that protects the organisation, reinforces that fairness, and supports learning, as we've already said. It also shows that decisions weren't arbitrary or reactive, but based on a process, a transparent process that can stand up to scrutiny. And then you've got communication. This is one of the most underestimated aspects of investigation work. People don't need every detail, but they do need to feel respected, heard, and kept in the loop. That includes setting boundaries around confidentiality, being clear about what comes next, and following through, because poor communication often causes more harm than the outcome itself. So as we go through today's session, I encourage you to ask yourselves, how well are these four elements embedded in your firm's investigation processes? And perhaps more importantly, how visible are they to the people impacted? So let's move on and let's take a further look. And so now we have the Mentimeter slide. So if you do get your phones handy, so let's take a moment to reflect on this question. What builds the most trust in an investigation process? So you might be thinking of all of these that matter. So I'm just going to give you a moment to start responding to these questions. And I do just need to run and get the door. I forgot to say that at the beginning. Apologies. Thank you. Have a think about your own organisations. Which of these is currently a strength in your organisation? So we've got like two, because we've got impartial investigations and we've got transparency about outcomes. Quite close together, still got some more coming in. So 26% on the impartial investigations. Just give it a couple of minutes. So this one, it reflects what we've heard in previously. So we've learning about these things and who leads the process really does matter. So people don't trust the investigator, they won't trust the outcome. So you can see why that's come up as top. And then you've got transparency and outcomes. Being clear about the process builds that trust. So that's good to see. So let's move on to the next section and start breaking down what the process actually looks like. So now we've looked at some of the principles of fair investigations. Let's break them down a bit. So the next section is designed to take you through the investigation process from beginning to end. So a step-by-step process. Because while every case might have its own little nuances, the core structure should always be the same. So that consistency is what drives fairness, transparency, and is defensible. So we'll look at how to assess a concern at intake, how to assign the right person, and let's think of this as the investigative backbone, the structure you can adapt depending on your size or complexity or context, but one that shouldn't be skipped or watered down. So as we move through each stage, I'll share some prompts for reflection, questions to help you consider how these steps show up in your own organisations. The first step, the intake and the initial assessment. So this is often overlooked, but it's critical. So how you receive that concern can shape the tone and the trust and direction of the entire investigation. So if this stage is dismissed too quickly or handled informally or met with silence, well, what happens next? It just discourages people not to raise concerns. So you've got to be mindful that everyone is watching. So what would good look like here? First, acknowledge the concern, no matter what it is. That acknowledgement, acknowledging it quickly and respectfully, even if it's just to say, we received your report and we will be reviewing it carefully. What that signals is that that really matters and that the process has kicked off. Next, clarify what's been alleged. That might involve reviewing written reports, clarifying vague concerns, or asking for additional context in a way that doesn't feel like you're interrogating someone. This is also the stage where we identify whether the issue involves non-financial misconduct and whether it falls within the scope for investigation. And then you've got to assess the risk. Are there any safeguarding concerns? Any regulatory breaches? Is it a high reputational risk? Does this involve senior individuals or any protected characteristics? So this helps determine the urgency and the complexity of the matter. Not saying that others aren't urgent, but it's just in terms of prioritizing it. And whether you might need some external input. Then you'll have to assess whether the issue needs to move into a more formal investigation or whether it can be resolved through informal means. You know, something like mediation, early intervention. But it's crucial that this decision is consistent and documented, because lots of firms get into trouble, not because they didn't investigate, because they didn't record how that decision was made. And then you've got confidentiality. Set the tone early, be clear about who needs to know, how the information will be handled, and what protections are in place for the reporter. Remember, trust in the process starts right here. So while intake might seem procedural, it's anything but. It's a moment of opportunity to demonstrate that respect, fairness, and clarity. And these are all the things you want the investigation to represent from the outset. So let's move on to assigning the right investigator. So once the concern has been assessed and you've decided to proceed down that formal route, the next and arguably the most critical step is selecting the right person to lead it. So the investigator you choose becomes the face of fairness in this whole process. So really want to emphasize here, it's not just about being neutral, it's about being seen as neutral as well as being neutral. Because too often organizations assign someone who technically has no conflict, but who's perceived as being too close to the situation. So that could be a senior manager from the same team, someone with a shared reporting line, or someone who has a past working relationship with either party. Even if this is perfectly fair, that perception of bias can cause just as much damage as real bias. So what does good look like? So the investigator needs to be independent and impartial. So they shouldn't have any stake in the outcome, and they need to be confident in navigating sensitive issues with care and clarity. Then comes credibility. That means understanding not only the procedures and regulatory context, especially in regulated firms, but also the cultural dynamics that shape how people perceive fairness, retaliation, or leadership involvement. In some cases, particularly where a senior executive is involved, or the issue could lead to significant regulatory or legal exposure, it may be necessary, and I say may be necessary to appoint an external investigator or a legal advisor. Because this not only ensures objectivity, but also demonstrates to your people that you took the matter seriously. And then clarity. When appointing an investigator, make sure their role, scope, and authority are clearly defined. Who do they report to? What's the timeline? Are they empowered to make recommendation? So this step, it's not just an administrative one, it is foundational. If people don't trust the investigator, as I've said, they're not going to trust the process. And if they don't trust the process, you know, even the most best intentioned investigation will end up backfiring. So let's move on and look at how to structure and gather the information. So this is really the heart of the investigation, evidence gathering. This stage, it's all about creating a well-rounded, fact-based picture, not just of what happened, but also of the context around it. And the quality of your process here will often determine whether the final outcome feels fair and credible. So let's start with the interviews. These are often the richest source, but also the most vulnerable to bias or inconsistency. The first rule is be prepared. Know what you're trying to understand before you step into that conversation. Use open-ended questions, things like, can you walk me through what happened? Instead of, did you see them shout at a colleague? Mindful of the tone and power dynamics, especially if the witness is junior or close to the issue. How you show up in that room matters as much as what you ask. document everything objectively, avoid paraphrasing in a way that might dilute or colour the issue, and importantly, ask consistent questions across all interviews. This helps you spot any discrepancies quite fairly and ensures you're not tailoring the process to the person. So in terms of sources of evidence, interviews, there's just one part of the picture. You might have a look at some of the documents and policies to understand what are the standards that are expected. Emails, often seen emails and internal messages, whether they're Teams messages that are downloaded as evidence, or emails to track timelines or the tone, prior complaints or informal feedback. Sometimes a single incident reveals a much bigger pattern. And even digital or operational data like access logs or performance records are relevant. So it's about balance, not trying to build a legal case, but building a reasonable, well-documented, proportionate narrative based on multiple sources. And this step is not about confirming a hunch. It's about being open to what the evidence is going to tell you, even if it complicates the overarching story. So keep fairness and consistency at the core, because that's what makes the step defensible and, more importantly, credible. So let's have a look at how we start to make sense of the evidence. So now you've got to this point where everything you've gathered, you've got the interviews, you've got the documents, you've got the context, you've got to bring it all together in a clear and structured way. And this is where fairness is most visible, not just in what decision is made, but in how it's made and how well that decision reflects both your organisation's policies and values. So let's start with the analysis. The goal here is to look at the evidence holistically, not just picking the most compelling account, but weighing everything that's been gathered. Are there any patterns? Is there corroboration? Do the timelines make sense? It's also important to assess credibility fairly. That means we don't assume someone is more trustworthy because they're more senior, or less credible because they were emotional. We assess what was said and what you've seen. How consistent is it, and whether there's any supporting information. So throughout this stage, your policy should be your anchor. What standards have been set out? What behaviours are expected? When you start aligning your interpretation to the written standards, it gives structure and objectivity to what might otherwise feel, well, let's face it, quite subjective. Then we move to the decision-making phase. Right, now you get to the point where you need to determine the outcome. And this is where proportion matters. When you're considering a disciplinary action, ask yourself, how serious was the misconduct? What was the impact on the individuals, on the team, on the wider culture of your organisation? What's the precedent? Has this happened before? And how was it handled? And perhaps most importantly, what signal does this decision send? Is it aligned with your organisation's values? Does it demonstrate accountability? So for regulated firms, this is also the point where alignment with frameworks like SMCR or CISC 18 becomes absolutely crucial. The FCA isn't just looking for action, they're looking for evidence of fair, proportionate and policy-aligned process. We heard from Matt Bruce himself, it's about the outcomes. Not everyone will agree with the outcome, but people don't need to agree with it. They just need to trust it. They just need to see that the process was fair, consistent and transparent. So as you move into the outcome phase, always ask, if this decision were to be scrutinised by an employee, a regulator, or actually even the media, would this process stand up? So let's look at documentation next. Oh no, we won't look at documentation next. We're on to the Mentimeter slide. So again, if you can get out your phones and scan the QR code and answer the question. So which part of the investigation process feels least consistent in your organisation? So it's not blaming anyone. It's about identifying any pressure point. Think about some of the experiences in your organisation. Think about whether a junior individual has spoken up versus a senior. Was the outcome the same? You know, you'll see different levels within the organization, not just seniority or how long someone's been in an organization. That consistency being applied. So which part of the investigation process feels least consistent in your organizations? You seem to have decision making and outcomes. Now that doesn't surprise me, if I'm honest. So we've still got some more answers coming in. Yeah, so that really doesn't surprise me. Because this suggests unclear standards for disciplinary action, or was it favoritism? Also touches on whether organisations apply their policies proportionately and predictably across the organisation. So this is where we see, you know, there's things are going through the investigation process, people start talking, but nobody ever knows what happened because the perpetrator turns up for work the next day. So people still don't know what action has been taken. So I think that decision making and outcomes didn't surprise me. And then communication. So with those involved, often overlooked but critical. So this might mean delays, or there's big silence, or it sends unclear messaging. And when this breaks down, people then start to break, you know, they don't have any trust in the process. And so they start questioning it and challenging. And that's when people then stop raising concerns. So that didn't surprise me, but thank you all for participating in this slide. So what's the next section? So in this next section, we're focusing on something that's the heart of every investigation: fairness and proportionality. Because how we respond matters just as much as what we found, as we've just heard from you all. So employees don't judge the outcomes, they judge the process that led to them. If actions feel excessive, inconsistent, or influenced by who's involved, trust is lost. So now let's explore what fairness really looks like in action. How to weigh up the severity, how to stay aligned with policy, how to make decisions that will stand up to scrutiny, regulatory or cultural, and internal. So this is about more than process. This is where culture is either reinforced or undermined. So this slide here focuses on one of the most sensitive and visible parts of the investigation: deciding what action to take, if any. Should any action be taken? And I just want to emphasize, disciplinary decisions aren't just about the individual, they're cultural signals. They show the organization's threshold for what is acceptable and what isn't, and how consistently it holds people accountable. So 4 criteria here. First, you've got misconduct severity. So look at the seriousness of the behaviour. What did happen? What was the impact of that? Was there, whether there was intent or not? Is this a one-off, a lapse in judgment, or part of a broader pattern? Did it cause any reputational harm, undermine any trust, or create risk to others? So this part really does set the tone for the proportionality. And critically, this is where we must be aware of the Employment Rights Bill amendments. So these were announced at the same time as the non-financial misconduct thematic report. These will hold employers accountable for preventing and addressing all forms of workplace harassment, even where there was no intent to cause any harm. So as we can see, the focus is firmly shifting towards the effect of the conduct, not just the perpetrator's mindset. So from October 24, this duty applies to sexual harassment. From April 26, it becomes voluntary for all forms of harassment. And by 2027, It will be mandatory across the board. So this means employers must be ready to act based on impact, not just intent, and that starts with how you assess the severity. Then you've got consistency with past cases. This is where credibility is either built or broken. If similar conduct in the past received a formal warning, but this one gets escalated and it leads to a dismissal, or vice versa, you need a clear rationale. What differentiated those two? Because otherwise, that perception, people start assuming bias or favoritism, and that can do more damage than the misconduct itself. Thirdly, you've got the organisational values. This is where we move beyond the policy and into the culture. And ask yourselves, what would this outcome say about who we are as a firm? So if someone breaches a value like respect, but the organisation responds lightly, the signal is values, well, these are just words. They're not lived principles, just another word on the wall. Then you've got the regulatory standards, particularly important across our sector. So things like SMCR, CISC 18, they don't just expect firms to act, they expect actions to be reasonable, documented and aligned with responsibility structures. So if disciplinary action is taken or not taken, it should be able to stand up to that scrutiny. So in short, we're not just trying to get the punishment right, we're trying to take actions that reflect fairness, proportionality and integrity, while standing grounded in precedent, values and the evolving legal context. So a lot to take on board there, because it's not just about the regulator, it is about the law as well moving forwards. So let's move on and see how we can learn and strengthen policy. So let's talk about one of the most important and really often underestimated aspects of running a fair investigation. As I've talked already, managing bias and conflicts of interest. Even the most well-intentioned investigator can bring unconscious bias into a process, even if the process is sound. The perception or bias can be just as damaging, as I've already said. So what are some of the common pitfalls? So familiarity bias is the one we see often, assigning someone to investigate a colleague that they're working closely with or someone they've had a good personal rapport with, even if they can be fair, others may not trust the outcome. Power dynamics are other key concern, especially in smaller firms or flatter hierarchy. It's often difficult to investigate someone senior to you or someone with close ties to leadership. So we also need to be mindful of more subtle biases, making assumptions based on someone's role, how they present or how credible they seem. They can influence how we interpret it, both evidence and behaviour. And then there's confirmation bias, where we go into an investigation thinking we already know what's happened and we interpret all evidence through that lens. So how can we manage all of that? Make conflict checks standard practice. So before you assign an investigator, ask the right questions. Do they know either of the parties involved? Do they have a stake in the outcome? Would others perceive them as impartial? So for senior or sensitive cases, bringing in someone independent often works, whether that's from another part of your business area, another part of your group, or externally. This may take more time and resource, but it protects your integrity and credibility outcome. And then you've got structured tools like interview templates or decision-making checklists. This can also reduce that room for bias to creep in, because they force us to look at facts and not make assumptions. And then the value of training. Bias awareness is not something most people are naturally skilled in. It needs to be learned and refreshed regularly. So we've all been there, we've all done it. And finally, where possible, have investigation outcomes reviewed independently if you need to. A second set of eyes can catch blind spots or raise fairness concerns before actions are taken. So the takeaway here is that impartiality isn't automatic. It has to be designed into your process. And when you do that, when you do it well, you protect not just all the individuals involved, but the organisation's reputation for fairness and integrity. So now let's move on to how this gets recorded and reviewed. But before that, we have a Mentimeter slide. So this question gets to the heart of what many organisations find difficult. How do we make fair, proportionate disciplinary decisions, and how do we do it consistently? So what is the biggest challenge when deciding these disciplinary outcomes? Still coming in, avoiding bias and favouritism seems to be the lead contender on this one. Because as we know, even if it's unintentional, this is always a major concern because perceptions of leniency, especially when it's that a senior individual or a high-performing individual versus someone more junior, that can undo the trust. That's why structure and documentation are really important. So, because these aren't just about the rules, just got to look at what the organisation actually stands for and what people are actually looking at and what they see. So let's move on and let's have a look at how documentation supports that fairness. So this section is all about capturing the process. And as I've said before, it's not record keeping. It's about being able to demonstrate fairness, defend your decisions, and learn from your investigations or your experience. Because if they're well documented, you've got clear audit trail. And I know I'm a compliance person, but well documented, clear audit trail, and you've taken all those reasonable steps, you've got something that's going to stand up to scrutiny. So we'll look at what good documentation looks like at each stage, how to link investigation outcomes back to your written policies, and how to use this material to identify gaps, drive policy updates, and support continuous improvement. So let's move on and let's have a look at documentation. So when we think about documentation, we often think of documentation as something we do after the real work is done. But in investigations, documentation is part of the real work. And done well, it serves multiple purposes. One, it creates a clear audit trail, tells the story of what happened, when decisions were made, and who was involved. So if the process is ever questioned, whether it's internally or externally, you've got your documentation. So it becomes the single most important protection, especially from a legal and regulatory standpoint. So this part is really essential. And then moving on, where we've got the legal and regulatory standpoint, this is whether it's an employment tribunal or an FCA review under SMCR or even Principle 11, they're going to ask, can you show your reasoning? Did you follow your own policy? Was it consistent with expectations? Documentation is what enables you to create yes, credibly and clearly. And then ensuring consistency. When you can look back at past cases and see how similar situations were handled, you will reduce the risk of bias or any disproportionate action. And you then start to build those layers of trust with your people. So, but it's not just defensive, it's developmental. Reviewing investigation records helps you identify where your policies or processes might be falling short. Were timelines unclear? Were some of the steps skipped? Did the outcome feel culturally misaligned? This is how organisations will learn and evolve. So that good documentation sends a cultural signal. It shows that concerns are taken seriously and that the organisation doesn't just rely on hearsay or their memory. It relies on a structured, transparent decision-making process. It's not about the paperwork. It's the foundation that supports fairness, accountability, and learning for years to come. So now let's look at how to use this documentation, not just to close cases, but to improve policy, drive cultural alignment over time. So when regulators review how a firm has handled non-financial misconduct, they're not just asking what you did, they're asking how did you do it, why you did it that way, and whether you can show some of that reasoning. That's where the audit trail is critical. So an effective audit trail shows you your collection of notes, structured record that shows the investigation process was timely, it was fair, it was aligned with your internal policy and your external obligation. So what are the regulators looking for? Clear timeline of events. When was the concern raised? When was it assessed? Who was appointed to investigate? When were interviews conducted? How long did the process take? So that simple chronology goes a long way in showing control and accountability. Then they'll want to see the evidence log, not just a list of documents, but a record of what did you ask for? What did you review? How did you get it? And how it informed the outcome. So that then helps demonstrate that the decision wasn't just an arbitrary one or one-sided. And then the rationale behind the decision. This is a big one. This means being able to explain why a particular action was taken or not taken. Was the outcome consistent with your policies? Was it in line with past precedent? If it wasn't, is there a good reason why it wasn't? Regulators just want to see alignment with your frameworks. So internal conduct policies, SMCR responsibilities, your escalation protocol. Saying you follow policy is one thing. Being able to show that you actually did is another. And we all know this. And finally, there's that review and oversight. Who signed off on the decision? Was there any challenge or second line input? This is particularly important in sensitive or high risk cases. Like I said, you might want to get somebody independent to have a look at that decision and the outcome. So to summarise, the strong audit trail isn't just a safeguard, it's a sign of your organisational maturity. It says, we're not just taking action, we're taking accountable, justifiable action that reflects our values, policies, and regulatory responsibilities. So one of the most effective ways to support consistency and fairness is to standardise it, have some standardised documented templates. So this slide outlines what a typical investigation summary form might look like. So the idea here isn't to add like unnecessary paperwork to make sure that every case, no matter how big or small, is recorded in a way that's structured, defensible, and aligned with your organisational values. So the core sections, starting with the basics. Give it a unique reference number, a date that it was logged, the individuals involved, remembering to keep names anonymised, especially if this has been shared beyond the core team that are involved. It also helpful to track how the concern was raised. This will inform future reporting trends, i.e. whistleblowing, through a line manager, through a trusted colleague, through an employee forum, whatever it might be, that then starts giving you some of those data points to start building your culture dashboard. Summarize the allegation. Again, keep it factual, concise, and avoid any assumptions. Reference the policies or standards that the allegation potentially breaches. Detail the investigation steps. Who led the process and why? Who was the investigator? Why? What interviews were conducted? What documents were reviewed? What timeline did you follow? Again, this creates that transparency and demonstrates that you've got a structured process. Document findings and the analysis. What facts were established? Were accounts consistent? Did you find corroboration? Was there any regulatory or cultural risk identified? Capture the outcome and action taken. Was the allegation substantiated? What actions were followed? Be clear whether there was a formal sanction or a learning intervention or a change in role. If the issue had to be escalated, for example, under SMCR. All of that should be recorded here. And then to close the loop, note if the outcome was shared with the reporter, if appropriate, what broader learnings were taken and whether any policies or training practices were flagged for review. And don't forget that formal sign-off. It shows internal accountability. So this kind of, broad template isn't just a compliance tool, it just helps to start shape your culture. It shows that the process is structured, not ad hoc, that it's evidence-based, not personality-driven, and that the organisation is serious about fairness, not just about the outcomes, but the whole process itself. So let's move on and explore further. But before we get there, let's have another Mentimeter slide. So phones to the ready. So what aspect of documentation is most often missed or underdeveloped? Think about your own firms. What have you seen? Where's the documentation? Where is it weak? Have investigations been conducted in your organisation? Have they just kind of disappeared and people just turn up for work the next day like nothing ever happened? The documentation rationale seems to be the one. Coming up top. So this seems to be one of the most frequent weaknesses. What was the thought process behind the outcome? Why that action was taken and not a different one? Because without this, decisions can look arbitrary, even if they weren't. Thank you all. We're now going to move on to the next slide, and I can stop talking at you for a bit. And we're going to break out into two rooms, each focused on a case study. One breakout group one will focus on ABC Marine, the small informal firm where leadership relied on personal relationships instead of a structured system, no formal investigation process, no documentation, and a strong culture of silence. And then the second group, the large firms, will be with me in room 2, and we'll look at a large firm with well-developed policies on paper, but where power dynamics, fear, and internal policies stop the process working. So, as I said before, when the case study is first presented, please do take a picture of it so that you can remind yourselves of some of the facts as we go into the discussion. So this isn't about critiquing these firms, it's about looking and recognizing similar risks or blind spots that might show up in your own organization. So we've got about 20 minutes. You'll automatically be assigned into your room, fingers crossed. And then after the 20 minutes is up, we'll all, even if we're mid-sentence, we'll pop back into this main room. And if you haven't been allocated, if you're a late joiner or anything, and you don't end up in one of the rooms, I think you might end up in the main room where somebody will pull the case study up for you. So fingers crossed it all works.
Wow, about 35 years. How is it possible?
What? Are we all back in the room? We lost anyone, left anyone behind? We seem to have lost a few people along the, I think that's because we've gone over the hour, but I know we're here for 90 minutes. So I'm going to canter through. There's a few more slides to get through. So let's go into solution mode. So this checklist pulls together the key takeaways from today. So simple practical steps that can help strengthen non-financial and how non-financial misconduct investigations are handled. So if we move on to the next slide. So we've talked a lot today about the process. But none of it works unless the people running the process are equipped to do it well. And we had in our session earlier on, people saying, I don't have the tools. So this talks about how to build that and maintain internal capability, probably not answering the questions that were raised in the large firm case study, but it is about investigating fairly and escalating with confidence and learning from that experience. So it's about training the investigators. So it's practical skills, how to ask the right questions, how to document things clearly, how to manage emotion and risk in a conversation. So it's also about deeper awareness, like unconscious bias that we've already talked about, cultural sensitivities, and how power imbalances show up in non-financial misconduct. Because you can't just assume that just because someone is senior, they know how to handle it. Then you've got the clear escalation routes. You know, people at every level should know when something when is something a line manager issue. So when should HR step in? When does it need compliance review or board oversight? So sometimes people don't trust HR. They do want to channel into the board or informally, but it's a very difficult one because you say you've got the whistleblowing lines, and this is what we were talking about, having some of those informal reporting mechanisms. But this is about the formal investigation toolkit. So it's about removing that ambiguity. It's about making sure that some of these concerns don't just get stuck in the process in some of those grey areas. Audits and reviews. So this is how we learn. Some of the case reviews. What did we see? What was held up? Where it didn't? Did investigators follow the right steps? Were the outcomes consistent? So it's about building trust through accountability and continuous improvement. And so building capability, it's not just about the resources, it's about the confidence. Confidence that when something does go wrong, your people and systems will respond with clarity, fairness, and integrity. So it's also important to recognise that not every investigation can or should be handled internally. As I've said, sometimes you need some external support. Sometimes you need some external support. So this doesn't signal that there's a failure in your process. It often signals the opposite. It's a commitment to that fairness and being neutral, you know. And if there's a conflict of interest, for example, or if the accused is a senior leader, or if it's something that's quite contentious, you might want to bring in someone external. Then it's complexity, you know, allegations that involve harassment, discrimination, whistleblowing, or potential breaches of regulation under SMCR or Principle 11, you know, the ones that will bring into scrutiny the whole of the firm. So you might want to bring in external investigators for those kind of issues. And then often, you know, especially for smaller firms, it's a capacity issue. You might not have anyone in-house with the right experience. Or if it's a high stakes case that needs to move quite quickly, people might not have the capacity to be able to do that. And then there's the credibility, because if staff, like we said, don't trust the internal process, or if the board or regulators are watching closely, that external support adds that reassurance and, you know, that legitimacy to the outcome. So it's about bringing in help isn't a weakness, it's bringing in help for when you most need it. And it's your turn again. So which of these would most strengthen your current investigation process? So you've got investigator training, policy clarity, better escalation mapping, templates for consistency, cultural reinforcement from leadership. Yeah, well, that's sends a clear message there. It's clearly telling us that fairness isn't just procedural, it is cultural. People watch how leaders respond. Reinforcing investigation integrity from the top, as we've learned before, is absolutely critical for building that long-term trust. So this will probably be the area that will be your biggest opportunity to strengthen the approach in your organisation. It's still come out top. Right. Thank you all for your participation in this one. We're nearly done, so I'm going to canter through. So I'm trying not to speak too fast, but I know that we've only got about 10 minutes left. So as we bring the session to a close, this is the last section. It's looking at what's the one thing you're going to take away and act on today. So we've looked at lots of different things. So it might be training your investigators, it may be bringing your documentation and processes in line, making it more consistent. So whatever it is, don't wait for the next incident to test your system. Take some of the learnings from today and start building it. Let's look at some of the practical steps. So this slide here, it can help you turn insight into action. So it's as simple as reviewing your policy documents, check that they reflect your actual process. And we've said before when we did something on policies, a workshop on policies, that these policies are meant to be read by the people within your organisation, and the processes and procedures are there to be used. So it's about them being clear, not something that you want the regulator to come and mark. So making sure that, you know, if you had to walk through those steps, is it really clear what you need to be doing? Or maybe it's booking some investigator training for those who are leading in these cases. So you might want to identify a population across your organisation and arrange some investigator training so that you've got key people at hand. Might be mapping out your escalation route, making it really clear who handles what and when, so how things move up the chain, so people can see it and you start building up that trust. Because if your documentation process feels vague or inconsistent, that's not really a great place to start. So having a standard investigation summary template will start to make things easier, make them consistent. And it's that cultural messaging that it will send out to your employees about reinforcing that fairness and accountability quite visibly. So, promise you, last one. So what's the first step you'll take after today's session? We've heard quite a few things, so it's that first intentional action that will help start moving. It'll be small steps, but start moving in the right direction. Yeah, I was expecting, yeah, I can see. I see the answers still coming in. I mean, personally, I would have expected that from speak to leaders about escalation routes, about, you know, not so much the more formal one, but the kind of informal escalation routes, because often it's not clear to people. They think it's just that one formal route, and I suppose it's that retaliation and making people feel safe to be able to report. So that's the conversation to have with leadership around escalation. And so that doesn't surprise me. And documented templates, that's a really smart structural move, because once you've got everything documented and a clear process, people trust the process, and there's no scope for any kind of bias in that. And it doesn't need to be perfect, it's just a place to start. So those two things seem to be a great place to start. Speak to leadership about escalation route and start introducing some documentation templates. And very quickly, let's move on as we wrap up. So 6 key things that sit at the heart of fair, effective investigation. So fairness, as we've said, it's not built through assumption. We can't rely on instinct or informality. It's a clear, consistent process that makes sure that everyone's protected. Then second, who leads matters. So people need to trust in the investigator, because this shapes the trust in the process. So that means someone neutral, some training, and managing those perceptions of bias. Third, you've got documentation. This is your defense. This is your get out of jail card. So not just both from a culture perspective, but more from a regulatory perspective. If it If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So your records need to be absolutely clear and show every step of the process. Disciplinary outcomes send a wider message. They're not just about one person, they reflect the organisation's values. Then you've got escalation and governance. This must work in real life, not just on paper. So people need to trust it. They need to know how to raise concerns, where they will go, and that somebody is listening and will do something about it. And finally, culture change starts with small, visible action. So whether it's just putting together a template, having a training session, or a single policy review, the first step will start to build that momentum. And it will also show people that you're taking it very seriously. Right, so we've covered a lot of ground today. So workshop 5. So this is here to let you know what's coming up next. So you might want to take away after today, investigator training, we've looked at that, escalation routes, we've looked at that. So having that standard summary investigation template is a really good place to start, and also having those conversations with the execs, with the leaders, with the boards. You know, for those of you who've got access to an INED, just raise it with an INED in your next one-to-one in terms of what you'd like to see. That's one way of starting to make some changes within your organisations. And I think we've got 3 minutes left, probably not enough for questions, but if anybody does have a burning question, please do ask it. If not, then pop it into the chat. If we still haven't got time to pop it into the chat, then I'm going to say send it to Andy and he'll forward it on, or any one of your trade bodies. They'll be happy to forward on the questions, and we will provide a full FAQ. And whilst I'm still talking, I've already talked about the next workshop, because we've got 2 left. One is around governance and oversight, and the next is about the promoting a positive workplace culture. And these are your people that you can go to, which will be in the slides. And whilst I take any questions, I'm going to leave the feedback question up there, and for people to say, yes, you should stop talking so fast. So anybody got any burning questions? We've got 2 minutes left. Can't see any hands up. Andy, anything from you last?
No, there's no questions have come in the chat either. So I think, Sunita, as always, thank you so much. That was another full-on session, so I suspect we'll all go away and catch our breath for a moment now. As Sunita says, the next session is on the 9th of September, so we do pause for sort of 6 weeks or so. So really, just final comments from me are thank you once again for your contributions, attending, and for those, I guess, who have got plans for a summer break, enjoy, and we will see you in early September for our 5th session. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.